Vanessa, if you can confirm with me, do you just see the opening slide?
Yes.
Great.
That's up. We can see it.
Okay. And are you able to see other other cameras, for example, like my video feed?
Yep.
No, I just, no.
Oh, I am.
I can see the next slide.
Oh,
and
you?
slides on the bottom as well, but not your video feed.
Okay. So you can actually see my presenter view.
I believe so, yes.
Aha, that's not what I want. Okay, thank you. Let me swap displays. How about this?
Just the initial slide.
Perfect. That's what I'm looking for. Thank you. Great. And I guess Julian or Jaka, if you can let me know when you want to kick things off, please do.
You're good. Go ahead.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you all, just first off, for being patient and working with us through all the technical things that we're currently sussing out here. It's a lot to organize, a virtual conference of over 1,000 attendees with multiple sessions. It's the new world, the new normal that we're in. So just thank you for your patience, and thank you to, of course, our panelists who joined us today, who've been so flexible. So I guess I first wanted to welcome you, right, to the City Leadership session. I'm Zen Trenholm, the Seed Fellowship Program Manager for the Democracy at Work Institute. We're founded by the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives as the national organization dedicated to expanding the field of worker cooperative development to reach communities most directly impacted by social and economic injustice. So today we are going to speak with 3 visionary city champions who are integrating worker ownership into their departments and programs to support business retention or to create employment opportunities for those locked out of the job market. This will be a conversational session where we'll share some stories, get into the process and the vision for this work. And importantly, our city partners are here to share with us their perspective and tips on how you might move this work forward in your city. So just to get started here, and I should note that, if you have questions over the course of today, if you could, add those to the chat pointed towards the moderator, that'd be fantastic, because at the end of this session, after our conversations, we'll have a little bit of Q&A. So kind of in the interest of our time here, I'm going to kind of breeze through a little bit of the preamble so we can get to the meat and potatoes of this session. But just to say that we're in a really difficult period right now. And cities are at the forefront of really facing this unprecedented crisis and meeting the needs of their community members. And the question for us, and the question for them, right, is how can worker ownership be a solution? Naomi Klein a little earlier today mentioned that the work of rebuilding isn't about rebuilding broken systems, right? It's not about going back to business as usual. The economy wasn't working for many people before this crisis. So what are we rebuilding back towards? What are we creating kind of out of this chaos, out of this crisis? And the question is, how can worker ownership be one of the tools that cities use to move forward? So, Dowi's worked with over 10 cities around the country to support worker co-op development as an equitable economic development strategy. And, we've learned a great deal about the unique role that cities play in the development of worker cooperative ecosystems, as well as the obstacles, right, and opportunities that shape them. And I think, all that we've learned has really come through our city partners who've, with great patience and commitment to shared equity, have taught us what is needed to integrate worker ownership into city policy and practice. So we've invited these partners to share their vision experience with us today. So, to kind of show us what they've been doing to lay the groundwork for more resilient and just local economies while meeting the needs of their communities today. So we are really fortunate to be joined by Chris Dickey. He's the Economic Development Coordinator with the Office of Economic Workforce Development in the City of Durham. He's going to be speaking about the city's work with Dowi to preserve their longstanding Black-owned businesses through conversions to employee ownership. We also have Sam Jung, Assistant Director of Business Development and New Economy Initiatives team at the Deputy Mayor's Office of Strategic Policy Initiatives at the City of New York. He's going to talk about his work to more broadly integrate economic democracy citywide, and how this builds on New York City's over 5-year investment in building the worker cooperative ecosystem there. And finally, we have Richard Whipple, Deputy Director at the Office of Civic Engagement, Immigrant Affairs with the City and County of San Francisco, who'll speak about their partnership with Dowie to launch a rapid response cooperative for graduates of their Dream SF Fellowship. So joining our panelists in conversation is my colleague Antu Nguyen, Director of Strategic Partnerships. She will have a conversation with Sam Jung about the work in New York City. We have Vanessa Brandsburg, our Senior Managing Director, who will speak with Richard Whipple about the Rapid Response Cooperative Collaboration. And then of course myself. I'll speak with Chris Dickey about the City of Durham's legacy business preservation work and their participation as an inaugural cohort member of the SEED Fellowship. So as I said before, after our chats with our panelists, we'll have a little bit of Q&A. So please send questions to our moderator and we'll get to them at the end of the Q&A. So now I just want to pass it over to Vanessa to introduce the rapid response cooperative model and to tee up a conversation with Richard Whipple.
I'm going to jump in quickly. Sorry, because I think there was a small tech thing that we wanted to do before we got started. The session initially said, turn on my camera, hi everyone, I'm the tech and language support. The session was initially going to have closed captioning, but since we had to switch Zooms, that's no longer possible. And I just put in the chat some guidelines for how you interact. And I'd like to ask people to turn off their videos if you're an attendee and you won't be presenting to help with bandwidth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great. Well, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this very important session today. And it's my pleasure to have a conversation today with Richard Whipple. But before I sort of gear some questions towards him, I will describe really briefly what is the Rapid Response Cooperative Development Initiative. So essentially this model that we've developed in the last 3 years or so, it uses a franchise-like model to create consulting worker-owned cooperatives that provide access to work for recent graduates and freelance workers with barriers to work. And so what Dowie does is it works in partnership with organizations and also higher education institutions to replicate rapid response cooperatives in their geography or their industry. Also licensing the model, networking the cooperatives at formation for shared services and benefits. And then finally, we connect these newly formed rapid response cooperatives to a member-led movement for worker cooperatives like the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. So all of the rapid response co-ops are actually branded and licensed out as Radiate Consulting. We have piloted 3 rapid response co-ops so far in Los Angeles, New York City, and now the Bay Area. And so we are also gearing up to launch 3 to 4 new rapid response co-ops in the following year, 2021, with 3 new partners. And so today we have the benefit of listening to one of the partners in one of these pilots through Richard Whipple, as we just are in the phase of developing this brand new Radiate Consulting in the Bay Area. So thank you so much, Rich, for joining us today. I am going to ask you a couple of questions, so feel free to jump in after the first one. So Rich, if you can actually start by describing what was the impetus for this partnership with Democracy at Work Institute, in particular around the Rapid Response Cooperative Initiative. How was it formed for you, and why were you interested in exploring worker ownership?
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. I'm really delighted to be here with everyone. I apologize for the weird lighting. This is like the smoky San Francisco sky that you're getting real time. But I'm happy to speak to our partnership with Dowie and our support of the Rapid Response Cooperative Development. For those of you who don't know, our Office of Civic Engagement and Immigrant Affairs, as mentioned by Zen, is a city agency. And so we're really tasked with really being a bridge between the city structure and community members that are immigrant regardless of status. So we do a broad range of work, whether it's policy work, direct programmatic work, grant making, and compliance work. And so I think that's important to kind of mention in terms of the larger frame of why we were interested in exploring worker ownership. We, for many years, have operated a wide range of immigrant assistance programs here at OSEA. And that includes programs that we operate directly as an office and programs that we support as a funder. Those have primarily looked like immigration, legal services, and other immigrant assistance programs. But one of those programs in particular, our Dream SF Fellows program, is one that we hold as an office and that really has been geared towards providing professional development opportunities and income generation for undocumented folks, regardless of status. This program, Dream SF Fellows, kind of grew out of our DACA legal services portfolio around 2014, 2015, when we heard loud and clear from the community that while some undocumented immigrants were getting access to work authorization for the first time through DACA, many others still were not. And even those that were getting access to work authorization still didn't really have the same access to professional development opportunities. And so we kind of took a lot of this feedback and a lot of our conversations and decided to launch a fellowship program. And the way that our fellowship works is that we recruit and have about 15 fellows in a cohort that lasts for 1 year. During that year, we place our fellows in immigrant serving nonprofit organizations here in the city and give them a kind of a part-time assignment providing support to these nonprofits while we compensate them in the form of a stipend. This is a program that we've had in operation for many years. And as I mentioned, it's a year-long program. It's really great. It's very effective at giving people that 1-year opportunity. But we realized that after that year is up, a lot of folks were still left without the ability to get a different opportunity, whether it's to pursue their own ideas of ownership, whether it's to get another job, because of barriers around work authorization. So when we connected with you, Vanessa, and with the larger kind of team at DAWI, we were really keen to explore what kind of an extension of our own fellowship could look like in terms of having a more stable, ongoing, permanent way for folks to take greater ownership in their work and their professional skill set and how they can offer that back to the community. We felt like it was a good fit in particular to our Dream SF Fellows program because we had a connection and network of nonprofit providers that already worked with these fellows that would be potential kind of clients in the future. So that's kind of how it was formed and why it was formed. We were excited that we just launched, I think, was it last week, Vanessa? Super exciting, our virtual launch. And great that we are like super pleased to announce that we have a pretty decent sized cohort of nearly 15 member owners that are now part of the Bay Area Radiate that are offering an amazing range of professional services that I think that they've curated and accrued during their time in our fellowship.
Thank you, Rich. And so could you walk us through a little bit on how the process was to build out this partnership and to be able to connect to developing this cooperative with us? What were kind of the blocks that you had to move around internally? And then also, what are you working on now in terms of making the connections for the worker owners?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're in the context, and those of you who are working in an immigration context know that the last 4 years have been really, truly horrible. And it's been an onslaught of really just xenophobic, punitive policy changes. And so I think as an office, we feel that we were always responding to the latest kind of punitive thing. So there was an impetus from us to really take a more proactive stance and to find more proactive ways to create space and allow folks these opportunities. And so I think in terms of how we approached building it out, I think, again, having the Fellows program was a great kind of natural partner and like launch board. That gave us connection to community providers that would be potential clients and also a good pool of potential applicants. We didn't narrow or require that anyone who's part of the Radiate completed our fellowship, but it kind of served as a natural pool for recruitment, right? So I think that was kind of our first approach is thinking about like, who are we recruiting to be part of this? I think in San Francisco, we feel a big stake in the success of the Radiate because we believe in the worker owner kind of cooperative model. And so we're aware there's a lot of attention, a lot of eyes on this project. And so we really wanted to be a good anchor partner to DAWI, who is bringing, through your team, all this expertise and kind of like content knowledge. We wanted to really bring the local partners and bring the local connection and the local expertise to make sure that this could be successful. So in terms of like more concrete steps, I think we engaged two primary stakeholder groups. One is our fellows alumni. We've had about 7 years worth of fellows, over 100 folks that have great skills that may have different kind of barriers to work authorization, but very keen to take on these opportunities. And then the other group that we engaged was really our grantee pool. We fund, as I mentioned, probably about 30 different nonprofits that serve immigrants. And so we engaged them to find out, like, is this a model that you all feel is useful? You know, do you have community members that you would refer to this? Would you utilize a service like this and hire consultants like these to help do work that you need done in a multilingual, culturally competent way? And so I think those were some of the first steps that we took and got kind of green lights and a lot of positive energy after doing that temperature check.
Right. So in terms of, you know, your work internally, I wonder, I think probably people that maybe, you know, calling in that work at cities, maybe thinking about, you know, how to get buy-in and making the case for bringing in worker ownership as a tool for economic development. And so I wonder if you could talk about, you know, what you needed to do, Rich, to secure buy-in, both internally within the city and then externally for this project. And then, you know, throughout that process, what are some things that you learned?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because it's at a very unique time, right, with COVID-19 and everything happening. And so I think in some ways it felt very challenging to be building out and launching something like this when resources are scarce, when employee time is scarce. But I think one thing that we did to secure buy-in is really utilize that strategically in our framing. I think San Francisco, like many other places in the country, in the kind of economic boom over the last decade, has seen huge growth in the income disparity. It's not at all been an equitable economic growth. And so the COVID-19 disaster has kind of launched in the city an economic recovery task force that I've supported through some staff kind of support groups. And this task force of community and civic leaders has really been looking at what can we do to recover from this crisis, but in a more equitable way. How can we reset how our economy locally works? How can it be more inclusive? And how can it really focus in on those who've been left out? Whether it's because of their immigration status or criminal history or just access to resources and tools. So I think that was one strategy that I was really intentional around, is linking it to this moment that we're in and really framing it as an economic justice approach that would hopefully be a better step towards creating the type of local economy that we want. Another kind of thing that was important for us is thinking about the landscape that already exists and connecting to those partners and using that to build credibility. So in San Francisco, we have a day labor program, as many cities do, that provides employment, day of employment for undocumented workers. And that's already a very successful member-owned model, right? And so I think it was important to say, hey, we already do this. And as a city, we already fund and support similar initiatives, and they're successful. And the community is calling for replication of these models. And I think the other important thing that I would flag is that it was really important for us to identify allies and stakeholders that could weigh in. And in San Francisco, that really also looked like the Immigrant Rights Commission. And that's an advisory city commission, a body that is responsible to advise the board and the mayor about issues that relate to immigrants. So early on, we kind of came to the Immigrant Rights Commission, invited you and members of the DAWI team to explain what the rapid response model was and why cooperatives are so important and in this moment in time. And so as early as last fall, before we even talked about officially launching anything, the Immigrant Rights Commission, you know, held a hearing, heard about this as an important model, and we had early buy-in. And so I think it was a gradual step-by-step process, but by getting support from the community, from the Immigrant Rights Commission as a more formal body, it was easier to come back later on and say, like, you know, we've talked to the commission, we have their buy-in, they've authored a letter of support, and they've also included it in a series of recommendations related to our economic recovery. All those pieces at play were really, I think, helpful in building a broader case and in making sure that this is actually a community-grounded response, not just a solution or like a prescripted solution from our office saying, like, this is what you all need. I think we heard loud and clear, from other partners that it was the right path to take.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for walking us through all that. So lastly, I would just ask you, as you reflect, and think about, the fact that there's so many folks calling in from different parts of the country looking at sort of your experience and then the others on this panel, what would you say, Rich, is your advice, to other advocates in other cities, sort of what can they learn from your experience having done what you've done thus far?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of great learnings. I think there was a little anxiety on our part up front around like, can we really be an anchor partner and what does that look like? And so one bit of advice would be to be open to exploring, what your role might be as a community partner, as a city agency, and really explore what that looks like. So I think I've talked to a few other cities who are like, hey, that's really great. How do we replicate that here? And I don't think they have to have the same level of commitment or involvement as San Francisco's had, which has been pretty heavy on the recruitment and selection and community partnership. And maybe they don't have like fellowship programs like ours that are natural feeders or kind of a natural alignment, but they do have a convening power, right? And they do have deep community connections. So I guess my first bit of advice is just kind of think about the role that you all in your various lenses and organizations, the role that you can play to advance the work, whether it's actually holding of the cooperative itself or whether it's just being an ally and a supporter and kind of a director and connector to other agencies or other institutions. And I know in a lot of cases that might look like academia or higher education, where sometimes a lot of fellowships and cooperative models are easy to place or partner in those spaces as well. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying there are like many ways to be supportive, and it's about looking for those windows of opportunity and really defining the role that you all can take, whether the role is convening folks to kind of build a coalition or just to be a supporter or to actually hold more of the work. And we didn't have financial resources in the city. We didn't put in any budget, I should mention. So it's not like we said, here's this huge allocation. It was like, we don't have any money. We have a fellowship program, a group of folks that we know would be amazing member owners. And we have staff bandwidth to a limited degree to really help promote this internally. And so that was kind of like our recipe and our equation that we used to make it work. We partnered with our Office of Economic Development and other city agencies too, but we felt strongly because the angle for this worker-owned cooperative is really around immigrant rights and economic justice for immigrants, that we as the Office of Immigrant Affairs wanted to take a leadership role. Sorry for my speed talking. I know we're on a time crunch.
No, it's fantastic. Actually, there's going to be a little announcement being made shortly that we're going to extend for 15 minutes. But first, I want to just thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I think it's really special to sort of be able to pull out, champions like you and others on this panel to be able to reflect on what's actively happening for you, as you partner with us and you're seeing the development of worker ownership in action, and just to be able to have your candid sort of, experience, like lived experience. So thank you so much, Rich, for just sharing everything that you just did.
My pleasure.
So I'll pass it back to my colleague Zen to make a little announcement and then talk about seed initiative.
Great.
You're muted.
Yeah, so many buttons all the time. Well, thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, Rich, for that fantastic conversation. Just as Vanessa teed up for me, we're going to extend the session about 15 minutes so that we can really dig into these conversations and leave a good amount of time at the end for some Q&A back and forth, because that's really the heart of this, is really having an opportunity to connect our city champions with you folks who are doing this work in your communities or in your cities. So I'm going to introduce a little bit about the Seed Fellowship Program and the kind of the context that is for the work of City of Durham. So I manage the Shared Equity and Economic Development Fellowship, call it SEED for short. And the idea behind it is that we wanted to work with cities to help them equip new tools that allow them to address the widening racial wealth gap in their cities, to address displacement and the growing pressures around gentrification. Basically to help equip them with a new tool in their toolkit that they can combine with other tools to make it easier for people to continue living in their city and can kind of thrive as their city grows. And so we partnered with the National League of Cities which is the kind of the National Association of City Governments, to convene economic and community development leaders from US cities around the country for a year-long program around leadership development, peer-to-peer learning, technical assistance from Dowie and our guest experts on our panels, and to help them really develop an idea, turn it into a blueprint, help them implement that blueprint. And so, over the year, right, we're going to the city, we're meeting with stakeholders, we're working hand in hand with the city and their community partners to shape that blueprint. And then we walk the road with them. And they leave the program having taken the initial steps of implementation. And like, many of our teams, actually, the 8 cities you see here listed in the slide, City of Durham focused on preventing their long-standing minority-owned businesses from closing for good, simply for a lack of a buyer. So we helped them develop a roadmap for a conversions initiative to educate and support owners to sell to their employees. So by converting the business to worker ownership and keeping the jobs, the business, its goods and services in the community, anchored in that community, and turning those jobs into ownership stakes so that people in the community can continue to grow as the city grows. Most of our cities, Durham included really, did not have, I would say, as comparably robust of an ecosystem as perhaps maybe San Francisco or as New York City. And so a large focus of our work was around, what does it take to actually lay the groundwork for employee ownership? What does it take to lay the groundwork for legacy business preservation? And again, what is the role of the city in moving those pieces together, bringing the right partners to the table? What does that all look like? So again, it's very, very much about focusing on the ecosystem, figuring out what elements it needs to grow, and then again, contextualizing it, right? Because like one model can work in one city, but it doesn't mean that will work in another city. The contexts are different, the history is different, the dynamics are different, how decisions are made, how resources can get moved, what resources there are to begin with, all very different. But there's a sense of shared challenge and a sense of shared need to do something about it. And I think that's the beauty of our cities coming together in a community practice to figure out what can be adopted and adapted to each location and what needs to be, again, unique to the city itself. So with that in mind, I'd like to start a conversation with our friend Chris Dickey, kind of walk us through this kind of experience, given that City of Durham was part of our fellowship program 2 years ago, so 2018 to 2019 work. So Chris, I just want to start us off with a question, which is like, can you describe for us, I guess, the impetus for the city wanting to join this fellowship in the first place, and why you were interested, why the city was interested in worker ownership? And you may be on mute.
No, I'm not on mute. How's that?
You're not on mute now. We can hear you.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
You can hear me? Okay. Yeah. So the City of Durham, the interest, really, we were very fortunate, and how this came to us was through our city manager, and he wanted a department to take part in the Dowie and National League of City Seed Fellowship there, and it was a natural fit for the City of Durham's Office of Economic and Workforce Development. But although it was a natural fit, worker-owned, employee-owned concept, we really, as a department, really never took that on. So what we needed to do was to sort of educate ourselves on the process and get comfortable with the process to see how it would fit in reference to our overall economic development plan. Well, I think we're very quite fortunate, because about 2 years ago, what had happened was the City of Durham City Council adopted a new strategic plan, and as a part of the strategic plan, it talked about shared equity inclusion. And what we did as a department was to say, how could we as a city take this concept of worker-owned, employee-owned, and then make it a part of what we call our economic development toolbox. It fit perfectly with the city economic department, but how do we make it a viable economic development tool? And what we had to do was sort of look at the role of the city, and the city essentially is to expand the tax base, build infrastructure, but more importantly, what the city does is help stimulate processes to sort of create wealth within the city or city of Durham. And then secondly, what we had to do was to determine what would be the city role, because worker ownership, employee owned, that was not natural for us to do, but there was a role for the city to play. And as economic developments, what we're good as, and I heard the city of San Francisco, is that we're good at convening, facilitating, collaborating, and at sometimes, if we get around to good concepts, the city gets behind to fund to stimulate a process. And what we did was we put together a bunch of partnerships or partners that we felt like that could help support this idea. But more importantly, I have to give myself, well, the city has to give herself credit to Dowie, the National League of Cities, and also working in conjunction with the other cohort cities, because we all were having some of the same struggles in trying to understand as to how do we make this process work, because it was integral, because what worker-owned and employee-owned does it saves jobs, it stabilizes businesses, and it does business retention. And ultimately, when you do that, there's an economic impact there. And at the end of the day, what you're doing is that you're preserving wealth within the community. But more importantly, it is easier for the city of Durham to retain a business, stabilize a business, or then to recruit a business to our area. So essentially what we did was we knew that the African-American businesses here in Durham, we were losing them at a high alarming rate. So what we wanted to do was, as a key focus, was to focus on African-American legacy businesses. But what the challenge was that with other cohort cities such as Atlanta and Miami and Philadelphia, was that the challenge of we didn't have the data. And data, we just have to find a way to accumulate the data. And I'll leave it at that point, because I think what's going to happen is that as a result of the data, it allowed us to have a collaboration with some of the other city departments.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually fascinating. It's funny. I would say that Durham, kind of your how I would describe the approach you took with this was like just a healthy amount of skepticism. Not because you weren't enthusiastic, but that you really wanted to make sure that this could be integrated in your economic development work. But you knew that, again, the ecosystem hadn't really been built out for this. It wasn't like there was a lot of worker-owned businesses you could point your finger to. It wasn't as if, other previous policy had been passed to support this, not like the state had moved policy to support it. So it felt like there was a need to have a lot of conversations. And I was wondering if you could first maybe walk us through some of those conversations you had to have internal to the city to kind of normalize the idea of worker ownership. And then maybe a conversation you had externally to the city with maybe a key partner. Just kind of give us a sense of what it took for you as a champion to I think, bring other people to the table around this idea.
Well, the key was that when we had the comprehensive plan or the strategic plan that we were talking about, was that we knew there were other partners that were around the table that really needed to make an impact with this shared inclusion. So what we needed to do as the Office of Economic Workforce Development was that we tied in with Technology Solutions, who was looking to build a database for data.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to put a dashboard out there. With the equity inclusion, the city of Durham created a new department, equity inclusion. And then we had the budget department, which we had a Bloomberg grant or a Bloomberg fellow at our disposal. Mm-hmm. And then we had our office. So so there was the potential to say, okay, how do we connect all these departments that are looking to do something that does not fit perfectly? And our director came up with the bright idea was that dashboard data, we need data. Economic inclusion, we're trying to identify these African-American businesses that are out there and how could we fit this together? And what happened was we came up with the city of Durham came up with their first business annual survey, the first ever of its kind. And this happened as a result of the city of Durham really working through the seed process. Because through the seed process, what happened was as we built our business plan, one of the things that was identified was that you do not have the data and somehow you're going to have to create this plan to get this data.
Right.
And I would say with the National League of Cities and Dowie, when they came to the city of Durham for that week or for a few days, and we walked away with a workable plan that we could implement where we had community buy-in.
Mhm.
And ultimately what we did was we came up with a business survey. We got 700 businesses surveyed.
Wow.
Of those 700 businesses, we've identified 248 businesses that were, or at least 200 businesses that were African-American businesses. And of those businesses, we had 48, which we identified as 48 legacy businesses, which started the impetus for us to begin to create an ecosystem of how do we make this work within our system that had a focus on the legacy businesses within the city of Durham.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic, Chris. And I think what you're mentioning here about the lack of business data, I mean, that was something new for me coming into working with cities, is finding out that for many reasons, right? It's very difficult to have that database of small business to be able to say, look, let's target outreach in this particular way, right? Let's figure out, particularly with our legacy business owners, how do we support them with succession planning services? How do we support them as one of their options for succession plannings? Help them identify the way they can sell the business to their employees. And I think that was something we learned that across the country, either because, again, lack of resources at the city level, or even state preemption laws. I think at the state level, a lot of that data just doesn't exist. So like you said, it's really important to figure out how do we proactively capture that data, and how do we use that data so that we can do targeted outreach, can have a targeted impact, really, to help the city kind of meet its economic goals. So I think that's a huge thing that you established there, because it is about what is the infrastructure that's missing and how we fill in that infrastructure, right? Worker ownership, you can't just like pick it up and put it down. It's connected to all the other small business infrastructure in a city, in a place. So figuring out what's kind of missing there in the gaps, connecting, one part of the infrastructure to another, I think is kind of a really important lesson for any of us who are trying to figure out how work ownership can be tied into a city's work. So I think that's huge. And one thing I also want to ask to follow up on that, because that's a major accomplishment, is, are there any other accomplishments or things that you're working on next that you'd like to share here?
Well, what I should have mentioned, and I'll get into that, our accomplishments, and I'll keep it simplistic, is what was important was the assembly of the team that we put together. Once we put our plan together, we had the city of Durham, we had our community fellow, and then we had some folks that had a working knowledge of worker co-op employee ownership. And I think what was critical, and you didn't mention it, but what happened was we established a nonprofit organization, not we, but our office in conjunction with Dowie National League of Cities and the city of Durham, created the North Carolina Employment Ownership Center, a nonprofit organization which has a statewide presence located in Durham, but it has a focus on providing technical assistance to some of these African-American legacy businesses that we talked about. So I felt like that was a major accomplishment. The other accomplishment was that we have a C's advisory committee that came into place. And with that advisory committee, we created an action plan, a 1-year action plan that we are currently implementing. I'm not saying it's easy, but we're implementing. And the city did give $20,000 to fund the North Carolina Employee Worker Owned Center. So I would think those are our accomplishments, but more importantly, I think that survey was the seed that got us started to create the collaboration between the 5 different departments that were there. So what I would say to people that are out there is that you really need someone that is passionate about the work. You don't have to understand it all, but someone that can organize it, collaborate it, but keep it moving. That's the most important thing, is to keep it moving, but more importantly, have a plan of action that really makes sense. And at the end of the day, if we may, in this 1 year that we've had, we reached out to about 10 businesses, and we understood that no, although there were 48 businesses weren't ready. 10 of them opened up the door to say, listen, we're ready to listen and maybe take on some of this technical assistance from the North Carolina Employee Worker Owned Center. That's
fantastic. Yeah, I'm constantly just inspired by the work of City of Durham and what you built. I guess your ecosystem focus, right? I think understanding that, look, seeding the development in the North Carolina Employee Ownership Center, while serving the state, also serves Durham at its current stage of development, right? And that as you're kind of identifying businesses that could serve as a proof of concept for the city of Durham, for the region in the area, for the state as a whole. I think you're slowly, again, putting the pieces together and bringing the right partners in. So I think those are some fantastic lessons. And I'm wondering if you have, as a final remark, any other advice for those on this call who, again, want to find someone like you, Chris, at the city of Durham, at their cities, to figure out, hey, how do I have this conversation? How do I connect the dots with what I want to see happen in our economy, what the city wants to see happen in our economy? What can they?
Two things, as I started off, was that pay attention to the city plan and try to connect the departmental plan to the city's overall plan. And then once you do that, you need a city leader. In our case here, we have a council person that really says, listen, I'm interested in this. So if that council person has an interest, that means what happened is that when we're talking and we're giving updates, this council person really liked what we were doing. So she being the council person was a sort of a cheerleader for us. And then secondly, what happened was that when we did the focus group, we took the data. We were able to do something with the data. We turned the data into something, we operationalized the data. And again, we found there were 48 businesses, but of the 48, 22 we were able to connect to. Right. And when we were able to connect with them, then we were able to provide the TA. And with that TA, we were able to take, and this is the point that I'm making, is that we were able to have metrics at the end of the day. We could measure what we were doing, communicate what we were doing, but more importantly, telling the impact that we were making to the community as a whole. Now, what we need to do with the city of Durham here in the Office of Economic Development, we need to do a better job of communicating our results to the broader community. That's what I would say. If you're doing the work, be able to communicate your measurements or your accomplishments of what you're doing.
Fantastic. I want to thank you so much, Chris, for your leadership in all this work. And of course, for joining us today to share some of those pearls of wisdom in doing all of that, because I do think, cities sometimes, are looking for cities that are kind of similar to them, right? Where they don't have an ecosystem or history of employee ownership. And I think Durham's a good example of a place that saw value in the form, understood what it took to make the work happen, and has, again, been building the road really thoughtfully with partners. So we're excited as Dowie to be partnered with the city, and we look forward to the next year of progress and all this. So thank you again.
You're welcome.
Great. I'm now going to pass it over on to Wynn to kind of lead us in the conversation about New York City.
Hi, everybody. Great to see such a wonderful turnout today, and thank you to all the amazing presenters who have come before me, Chris and Vanessa and Rich. It's great to have this robust discussion about how cities can be champions for democratic ownership, for worker ownership in the United States. And municipalities, we're seeing, truly are, in this political moment, the vanguard, where we're seeing a lot of the most interesting experiments. So I am based here in New York City, and I will be talking about the experience of the Worker Cooperative Business Development Initiative, as well as just the use of worker cooperatives in developing New York City's economic democracy policy, in collaboration with Sam Young, who is hi Sam, with the Deputy Mayor's office, with Deputy Mayor Phil Thompson's office. He is the Assistant Director of Business Development and New Economy Initiatives. So just to start, I'll open up with what has been happening in New York City for really the past few decades, but it's really gotten a huge jump start within the past 6 years. So what happened 6 years ago? In 2014, the New York City Council made history in the United States by passing the country's first municipally funded worker cooperative business development initiative, with the core championship of two visionary council members, Helen Rosenthal and Maria del Carmen Arroyo. So New York City has been the home since the 1980s of the largest worker cooperative business in the United States, which is Cooperative Home Care Associates. It's a home health care cooperative that is predominantly women of color, immigrant women of color led and run, and it's based in the South Bronx. And it's been a model to the rest of the country about what it looks like to transform a sector through worker ownership, in this case, the home healthcare sector. However, there really hadn't been an ecosystem to speak of in New York City. There were, pockets here and there of worker ownership as a strategy for workforce development, but there wasn't like a comprehensive ecosystem of policy that could really sort of jumpstart this world. And the New York City Council really provided that cash infusion. So since fiscal year 2015, which starts in New York City, starts in July of the previous year, so it started in July of 2014. Since July 2014, over $18 million in New York City Council discretionary funding has been invested in developing what has become now the largest worker cooperative ecosystem in the United States. In the past year, it recently outstripped the San Francisco Bay Area as the largest co-op ecosystem, and that has to do with the investment of the city itself, because San Francisco Bay Area has an incredibly robust and just ecosystem that's been in existence for really like the past 40 plus years now. So it's crazy to see how much city money can really contribute to developing this ecosystem. So it's become a model for how worker cooperative development can be an economic development strategy for cities that are hoping to tackle things like wage gaps, wealth inequality, and especially racial and gender wealth gaps. Historically underserved communities are leading the charge in worker cooperative development and engagement in New York City. In our most recent surveys, we found that 76% of New York City worker owners are women of color, predominantly coming from immigrant communities in places like the Bronx and Queens and in Brooklyn. The initiative is really prioritized empowering folks who have been locked out of the formal economy, including immigrants and low-income communities of color, as well as independent and gig workers in the service sector. So think cleaning, think construction, childcare, elder care. And the focus has not just been on startup cooperative business organizing, but also converting traditional businesses to worker ownership. Since 2014, the initiative, which has currently 13 member organizations, funded member organizations, and administered through Department of Small Business Services, has helped create 631 jobs in the city, 132 worker cooperative businesses, and has reached over 8,000 entrepreneurs with technical assistance services to strengthen their businesses. So in addition to what the New York City Council has done, we've seen a lot of engagement with the mayor's office. We wouldn't have what we have without those champions, both in City Council and the mayor's office. And especially with Deputy Mayor Phil Thompson, who has been a champion of worker cooperatives for decades now, since he has been a professor at MIT and beforehand. So we've seen worker ownership since becoming deputy mayor be a foundation for creating economic equity and inclusion, and offering opportunities for every New Yorker to become business owners, regardless of where they come from, regardless of immigration status, and regardless of really their access to wealth, generally speaking. So Sam, working in the deputy mayor's office, I'd love to hear more about how you've seen the development in the past few years since you've joined the DM's office of worker ownership, not just from like what we're seeing in kind of the ground up development of worker co-ops, but also in how the city is working to integrate worker ownership into city services, the Economic Democracy Initiative, and then just kind of what your thoughts are in terms of like where this is going.
Yeah, thanks Antu, and thank you first and foremost to all the conference organizers and DAWI staff for your labor, seen and unseen, to make sure that this conference happens, particularly this panel. And I think I just wanted to give a little bit of context as to the why of our strategy, the how, and what we're kind of currently thinking about in terms of our potential interventions. And so I'll start with the why, and I think there's two components of that, right? I think it would be safe to say that we're living in pretty unparalleled times. So I wanted to start with the context and then go to the vision that Antu was speaking to of our deputy mayor, whom I work for and with. And right now, you all know this, but just wanted to aggregate a certain series of facts to really characterize the current context in which we're making interventions. But unlike any other time, American workers are really feeling the impact of contradictory economic forces. There are trillions of dollars of business growth that are happening and billions of dollars of investment into businesses that are generating wealth for a small group of people at the same time that worker productivity has increased and worker income has unfortunately stagnated. I think to put a little texture there, since 2008 alone, there's been $10 trillion worth of mergers and acquisitions. In 2018, there was $250 billion of venture capital invested into startup firms and $1.4 trillion worth of private equity deals that happened in that same year. While at the very same time, since 1979, there's been a six-fold increase in our workers' productivity, while the racial wealth gap has widened. And it's a really salient and unfortunate fact that the proportion of Black families in America with zero to negative wealth has actually increased by 8.5%. And we're seeing in this context of COVID that those race-based wealth inequities are being exacerbated, right? Like American billionaires like Jeff Bezos saw their collective wealth increase by more than $500 billion, while more than 42 million American workers file for unemployment. So what we're seeing now is this incredible, unparalleled disconnect between work and wealth and a racial wealth gap that needs to be rectified. And I think that's where Deputy Mayor Thompson and his vision comes in. Like you mentioned Antu, Deputy Mayor Thompson was a professor at MIT and has a long-standing practice of researching and practicing inclusive and equitable business and economic development strategies with communities. So he came to his position with the imperative to realize economic democracy so that we might face and address the problems of our racial wealth gap so that we can create a more just, inclusive, equitable economy for our people and for our planet. So that was like the why. And I think the how of beginning to operationalize a vision of economic democracy through worker and shared ownership really started with, tactically hiring some folks that understood that vision in at City Hall. That's where myself and my colleague Christine Corella came in. And then when we tried to think about what strategies that we could implement at scale, we actually turned to practitioners, community groups, finance experts, and other stakeholders within the shared ownership ecosystem and business and economic development ecosystem in New York City writ large to figure out what assets do we have here locally that we can draw upon and work synergistically with in order to make real and tangible impacts towards the goals that I mentioned earlier. And so I think what we're thinking city needs now, particularly within this moment of COVID and the immense economic dynamics that we have to rectify are three things, right? That all relate to shared ownership. One, we really need to make private capital available at scale so that cooperatives, ESOPs, any enterprise along that spectrum of worker ownership is able to start up, grow, and or convert if they want to, especially knowing that we as a city are facing extreme fiscal limitations with regards to what we can invest. I think the second thing that we're really seeing as a need is sector-based business pipelines where we can source candidates that are viable for conversion to really scale up the practice and business form with employee ownership. I think this has been a real important insight that we've been able to garner because sector interventions need to be in place in order to make the most effective impact, and I can talk about that later as well. I think the third thing that we have seen as a need within the city is that there needs to be broad-based and deep education that is worker-facing and also business owner-facing, so that when, for example, a business that has been a sole proprietorship is transitioned to employee ownership, that those worker owners have the skill sets, capacities, the cultural shift, and the tools and capacities in order to really realize their agency as worker owners. And also for business owners who are in the process of exploring conversions or starting up as a worker cooperative or ESOP, that they have all the tools and information that are needed at a very tactical level, which is inclusive of legal guidance, business form guidance, tax guidance, et cetera, so that we can make all of those happen.
Thanks, Yam. So to follow up on these 3 points, of the importance absolutely of having capital available at scale, creating a sector-based business pipeline for conversions, and then broad-based education so that worker owners and business owners understand what they're getting into and what it means to become a worker-owned business. What are the steps that you're taking in the Deputy Mayor's office and with city agencies in order to facilitate, to address these 3 aspects, like just kind of the concrete foundational steps to just get to where you need to go?
Yeah, right now we're talking to a lot of stakeholders within the finance realm, particularly who have done transactions in the employee ownership space, to get their insights to best see what a strategy for private capital provision for the employee ownership market could look like. I think for the sector-based interventions that we know are needed, we've actually helped to stand up an industrial business conversion pilot this past year, so we're trying to build upon that. And then we're also conducting some research in partnership with our Economic Development Corporation to see what other sectors are best poised to benefit from the practice of employee ownership. And then 3, we're trying to see what assets are out there with regards to education that we can build upon and bring to New York City and scale up if and where possible. And I think a salient example here is the Mondragon Team Academy that came out of Mondragon University in Spain, curriculum around what they're calling teampreneurship, so that students could get inculcated in the practice and ethos of collaboration for innovation through shared ownership. So we hope to land that somewhere here. We've been in active conversations with community to see if that is a potential, and also obviously looking to Dolly with your incredible curricula that that we could mobilize at scale using the city's assets and tools.
So following up on that, like when we're talking about stakeholders, how have you, like what stakeholders are you thinking about? I know that New York City has basically a country in terms of the size of its budget. And there are a lot of municipalities here that are like, we are not New York City. We do not have the resources. We don't have 1 trillion agencies. How can you walk us through like how you've been able to, 1, reach out to stakeholders or identify stakeholders in a New York City context, reach out to them and then gain buy-in in order to, you know, get traction on things like financing?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the Worker Cooperative Business Development Initiative that you mentioned before. I think that has been an initiative constituted by different partners who bring immense contributions to our local shared ownership ecosystem that we find valuable to our strategies. And so I think that whereas the grantees and practitioners within that initiative are doing on-the-ground work that is super important to train folks, create co-ops, conduct conversions like the Working World, who I believe is on the panel today as a participant, and innovate like the good folks at Center for Family Life. We look to them as on-the-ground experts who have been doing this work for sometimes over a decade or two to see where we can go and give us concrete tools to be able to talk to folks who might not be, one, familiar or amenable to the strategy and practice of shared ownership. I think distinct from the WCBDI, the city in and of itself has the charge, which is a big one, to ensure the inclusivity, the equity of our economy and resilience of our economy. And so we are trying to distill the lessons that the practitioners have really garnered through on-the-ground work and see where we might intervene with our tools and levers that we have as a city to make impact. I think concretely to your question about how do we talk to folks who might not have heard about this in finance or wherever else, there is a principle that I like to draw upon, which I'm calling like the blend and lead. Blending here kind of refers to just meeting people where they're at. And the leading is to really, in turn, after meeting them where they're at, speaking a little bit of their language, pivot them to the power that shared ownership affords. So, for example, within our stakeholder engagement, there's usually like a process of cultivating buy-in, right? In that, what I'm calling blend and lead. We usually have to do some myth busting. We actually then have to do some broader education and then point to proof of concepts. And what I think we have learned in our work is that, one, on the myth busting front, seeing is believing. We often point to Mondragon, which is a transnational multi-billion-dollar confederation of worker cooperatives that, you know, look and feel very much like a Ford or another multinational company. And we point to them being like, that is actually a thing. Shared ownership is a thing, and it actually has market viability. So I think that is something that we use in that context. I think the second part around education is drawing upon validators who have done on-the-ground work and are actively making impact, that we can also bring in and point to as real people that are doing on-the-ground work. And these can include institutions like City Community Development, who has helped to resource our industrial pilot. Oliver Wyman, of all people, believes in employee ownership, which is a management consulting firm, and Mosaic Capital Partner, which is a private equity firm, actually, that is doing mostly ESOP conversion. So I think on the education piece, validation has been important in engaging new folks. And then third, I think, is that in terms of the proof of concept, is to really stand something up, right? And we have done that in partnership. The key to that success has been standing that industrial pilot with strategic partners who have credibility already in the New York City ecosystem, and then pointing to that work that has been done and saying like, hey, it works. So I think that has been generally some practices and some lessons learned that we've garnered through interacting with stakeholders and cultivating buy-in.
And finally, what advice might you have for other advocates in other cities, just given your experience doing, engaging stakeholders, building support and buy-in? What are the challenges that you've seen that others can learn from, the lessons learned, and especially in this moment of crisis that New York City is navigating with a massive budget deficit? What are the pivots? Like, what are the things that you're seeing that other cities you think can learn from?
Yeah, and I want to echo what other folks have said too. Every city is different, so I want to communicate some insights that we've gleaned, and also really respect the fact that every geography, every municipality has its own assets and also challenges in realizing shared ownership as a viable business and economic development strategy. I think, to your point, COVID, we had a strategy before COVID, and it looks drastically different now post-COVID. But I think the lessons that I'll speak to kind of have remained the same throughout those different periods. And I guess I'll just start with saying that like COVID in and of itself actually is what Naomi Klein would call a shock that has actually worked in our favor, because it now has opened up a space whereby shared ownership, worker ownership as a recovery strategy is now not only being considered as viable, but people are actually intrigued and willing to learn. So I think that there is a unique opportunity that this unfortunate pandemic has afforded that enables to make us to make greater impact. And so there are a couple principles, if you will, that I've kind of distilled through my work thus far. One, which I've mentioned, is the blend and lead, is to really meet folks within city government where they're at, try to speak some of their language and pivot them towards the benefits of employee ownership, which will require speaking some of different people's languages. For example, if they're finance or economic and business development folks, saying that like employee-owned businesses are 2.4% more productive and resilient actually in economic downturns has been compelling as one example to different folks. I think the second principle that I've really distilled is to plug and play. When we work with partners on programs, for example, like our industrial conversion initiative, it has been imperative for us as a city to figure out what in those discrete initiatives can we create, package, and make sure can fit seamlessly into existing city infrastructure and apparatuses, so that when that pilot program or initiative concludes, there are still tangible either standard operating procedures or the products that we can then in turn place into agencies like, for example, the Small Business Services Agency, that will afford not only a continuation of the good work of employee ownership that we had started in that initiative, but also can continue on beyond my tenure in city government, beyond the administration's tenure generally. And so I think that has been really crucial for us to learn and operationalize. I think to your point, we are constantly assessing and pivoting. I think whereas before COVID, we had some pretty far-reaching proposed strategies that spanned education, business pipeline, investment, procurement, and policy. We really understood that the context of COVID is really about addressing business sustainability and workforce. And there are specific tools and strategies that need to, one, be assessed and then pivoted to in order to meet the current demands and needs of our time. And so I think that has been a principle that we have really tried to follow and have learned. And then I think undergirding those three principles is, one, innovation. Deputy Mayor Thompson has been really instrumental in not just saying, hey, we need to have employee ownership as a thing and a business form and a practice for the sake of having more employee-owned businesses, but we're also trying to see how the principle of shared ownership could be applied to, for example, creating a data commons, whereby if tech companies are profiting off of our data that we're giving to them, is there a way in which we can collectively aggregate the consumer power of New Yorkers to aggregate their power of data generation and then monetize that somehow? It's not necessarily employee ownership outright, but it is really enacting that principle of shared ownership towards equitable ends that activate agency of everyday New Yorkers towards closing the racial wealth gap. So I think innovation has been really key. And there's been salient lessons that we've learned from Mondrian, for example. Their municipality there actively funds and partners with a research and development agency that might create, for example, solar photovoltaic roof tile that the public has IP over, but then enables markets to sell. So there's a value capture mechanism there, right? So we're trying to see in other ways how we might innovate upon the practice of worker ownership and use shared ownership as a principle to guide civic innovations. And then to the question around like cultivating buy-in, in part, it's been really important for us to identify champions, not only at the top level of governance, but from the bottom, so that we can have a top-down, bottom-up strategy that really enables us to make change where we can have impact as city staff, but also advocates on the ground to push for the change that we might not be able to do so as effectively. So I think I'm mindful of time. Those are like the lessons that we've learned, and happy to answer any of the questions later.
Thank you, Sam. And I absolutely agree with the last point you made. Champions exist at all parts of the city. Even if I always joke that when I worked on the Hill, the people who had the most power were like 25-year-old legislative assistants. Like those are the people, like this country is run by 25-year-olds. You just don't know about it.
I mean, they control the calendars.
Yeah, exactly. Whoever controls the calendar controls the world. So let that be a parting piece of advice for anyone who's with a city and thinks that can I be a champion?
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And moving back to Ben.
Great. Oh, that's a great note to end on. And I just want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today to have a really in-depth conversation. You know, not just about nuts and bolts, which I do think is extremely important for us to have, but also about vision and about like what it actually takes to build partnership with community, you know, build partnership with folks across agencies and at different scales of government and in totally different ways too. So I think I personally learned a lot in just having 3 conversations kind of simultaneous or back to back on again, the unique ways that our city champions are helping to normalize worker ownership and include it in economic development work. So I know a bunch of questions come in, so I'm gonna shift over to that now. But again, just wanna thank our panelists for joining us today. So I'm gonna stop my screen share so I can actually see all the panelists on the same screen. And I wanted, we have until 1:45 Pacific, 4:45 Eastern. So I think we probably have time for 1 or 2. So I'm gonna try to grab questions that I think maybe capture a few voices here. So there's a question from Vijay. How did co-ops in either of the cities have services that the city government could procure? And if yes, did the cities work with local co-ops to procure the services? And I think that's probably maybe best directed to Richard and to Sam. So maybe Richard, if you want to talk about the city's role as an anchor in the context of this question, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the question also included the piece around whether the city could then hire the folks that are member owners, correct? And I think I talked already about kind of our role as like anchor partners in the development and creation of the cooperative here, the Radiate Professional Services Cooperative. But immediately after that was us thinking through like, how can the city flex its own spending power and its own budget to invest in these local immigrant business owners by utilizing them as service providers, as clients, essentially. So we just launched, as I mentioned, a few weeks ago, but we're already in the process of walking through, and part of the kind of added value of our office is trying to walk this new Radiate cooperative through the city vendor process, which, like all bureaucratic processes, is not cute, but it's also not the end of the world. It's not super hard, but just having a city liaison that can say like, here's the city vendor process. Also, it's a bit crazy because of COVID. We're gonna walk you through all the necessary forms and make sure that you meet all the prerequisites to even be an eligible city vendor. And then on the flip side of that, I think we have a lot of work to do with the Office of Economic Workforce Development and other city agencies who are always asking our office, like, we need interpretation vendors, we need translation vendors, we need community outreach vendors. So I think it's a 2-part thing of like getting Radiate qualified to act as a city vendor, and then promoting this great opportunity to our sister departments within the city and reminding them that it also aligns with the city's values and priorities around hiring local, around supporting residents and being culturally competent with the work. So that's kind of, we're just getting started with that. So that's probably not the most helpful response, but those are our plans and intentions.
Thanks, Rich. How about you, Sam?
I'll note here quickly that all of our city procurements are open to any businesses that are competitive, regardless of business form. So cooperatives are eligible to apply for any contracting opportunities that we have, and SBS, similarly to San Francisco, has support services that might help them be better positioned to win those contracts. I think this also begs the question that we've been having in New York City around should the city certify co-ops as employee-owned? We explored this and went into a long rabbit hole and tried to figure out if there was a viable path towards certification for employee ownership. I think given the fact that we actually have a robust MWBE certification program here and that most of the worker owners in the local ecosystem of worker-owned businesses are already workers of color, we found that to uphold that legacy infrastructure and its integrity, that we would in turn try to create a strategy to put co-ops on a path towards MWBE certification so that they might certify that way and access the support services afforded to MWBEs through that channel. I think certifying as MWBE has rigorous requirements, and we wanted to uphold the integrity of that, and found that it was a little bit harder given the many different permutations of worker ownership and in the business form, that it would be hard to certify. And I'll keep it there.
Great, thank you, Sam. And then I also want to bring Chris into the conversation with another question, actually. A little earlier, Sandra asked, Chris, has a process started for any legacy business conversions? So from the 48 businesses that you identified, is there a kind of a pipeline strategy for those businesses who weren't maybe ready to have the conversation now, but to kind of work, connect with them and stay in touch with them so that they can be prepared to have that conversation down the line? I wonder if you can shed a little light on that.
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me? Just want to make sure. Can you hear me, Vin?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. Just want to make sure. Yeah. So what I didn't mention early on was that we are generating a pipeline. We understood that when we took over this process of contacting businesses that we were going to meet them where they are. A lot of businesses really didn't understand the concept of worker employee ownership or worker-owned employee ownership. So our job was to educate them first, which is why the relationship between the North Carolina Employer Ownership Center was critical, because they could provide the initial TA assistance to do the education that the system could, that the city could not provide.
Mm-hmm.
So the short answer is yes, we did develop a pipeline. We're working through that. During this COVID process, the city has also employed 2 other consultants to help us build the pipeline. And essentially what we're looking to do is to put a RFP out, probably hopefully in about another 2 or 3 months, to put out to start a more expanded process of this legacy program fund.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, Chris. So we have the last minute here. So one thing I wanted to just voice here as a final question, mostly as a comment, but Jeannie from the Bronx said, currently not employed in a worker cooperative, though employed now. I'm wondering what are ways I can get involved to help the efforts to develop worker co-ops in New York City. So maybe we don't have to go too much detail, but Sam or Antu, how can folks get involved in helping build out the New York City ecosystem?
Oh, wow. Well, if you're interested in learning about it, go to U.S. Federation, associate member, which is the New York City Network of Worker Cooperatives, so nycworker.coop, has opportunities to engage. And through the city, if you go to just Google Worker Cooperative Business Development Initiative, it will come up with through SBS, a bunch of the different organizations that you can engage with in the city.
Great. Thanks, Antu. So I'm going to wrap up here. I know we got, I think, an evaluation thing that's coming out as a link in the chat. That really helps us make sure we can produce, excellent programming at this conference and, of course, beyond. But with that being said, I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us in the conversation. I want to thank Richard, Sam, and Chris for joining us today to share their experience, share their work with us. And of course, my colleagues Vanessa and Antu for having that really engaging back and forth, and for their, the program work they do with each city. I think there's really some exciting stuff that's happening right now. I think there's a lot of work that can be done, that is being done, and there are so many ways to plug in, as you saw here. So If any of this inspired you, any of this interested you, please feel free to reach out to Dawi. We'd be happy to connect you to folks doing that work locally, doing that work regionally. And if we can be a resource for any of the specific programs that you heard, again, feel free to reach out to us on our website. So I want to see if the conference facilitators have anything else you want to say here.
Thank you for everyone who has attended and engaging in this. I know it's a lot of work and it can be a grind on the day-to-day basis, but we are building something really incredible.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone. And yeah, appreciate you all joining us today.